When Congresswoman Katie Porter pressed the chairman and CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, on how a single mother could survive on the entry-level wage that he pays at J.P. Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon eventually came up with the idea of calling up that single mother and seeing if he might be able to find a way to advise her toward solvency.
I'd love to call up and have a conversation about her financial affairs and see if we can be helpful.
See if you can find a way for her to live on less than the minimum that I've described.
Just be helpful.
Well, I appreciate your desire to be helpful, but what I'd like you to do is provide a way for families to make ends meet.
And joining us now is Democratic Congresswoman Katie Porter from California. She's a member of the Financial Services Committee. Congresswoman Porter, thank you very much for joining us again tonight. So did Jamie Dimon ever call you up and explain to you how he thinks that hypothetical single mother could survive on the $16.50 an hour?
Absolutely not. It's been 3 months to the day since we had that exchange at the hearing, and I finally received a 5-sentence letter from his lobbyist, not from Mr. Dimon himself. And the letter basically says that they'd be willing to meet with me in my congressional district to discuss their philanthropic work. And I'll be honest with you, my constituents, they work hard and they want to be able to make ends meet themselves. They want to be paid a living wage so they can go into the grocery store and take care of their families. They don't want to hear about the corporate philanthropy and handouts that J.P. Morgan Chase is trying to get away with to distract from the real problem here, which is they're not sharing in the incredible revenue, including the windfall from the Trump tax plan that the bank is earning.
I read the lobbyist's letter to mean that he wants to basically sit you down and explain to you how important J.P. Morgan Chase is to your congressional district, something that big business has been doing to members of Congress for a couple of centuries now.
Yeah, that's going to be a hard pass. I don't need to be condescended to. I want to work on these problems. I'm really serious about the difficulties that families face in making ends meet. It's what I studied before I came to Congress, and it's what I think about every day. So I don't need to be pandered to. I don't need to be told that they have employees. I know that. I talk to my constituents. I know I have folks that work at J.P. Morgan Chase. I have a Chase branch right next to the grocery store I go to with my kids. I want to hear about from Mr. Dimon, who wants to wear the mantle of the leader of the business community. You want to wear that mantle, then with that comes the responsibility to come up with real solutions to the problems families are facing around wages, around the high cost of housing, and the high cost of childcare.
And the gap you identified when you worked out all the expenses was $567 a month. And no one has suggested to you any way of making up that gap from J.P. Morgan Chase, including the wild idea of how about paying more?
Yes, they completely refuse to address that. And frankly, you know, as I listened to this clip again, which I've watched several times, you know, I found Mr. Dimon's answer that, I don't know, I'd have to think about it. I don't know, I'd have to think about it. He wasn't even responding and thoughtfully to the questions. He just decided that he simply wasn't going to engage with me. And I was really making a good faith effort to have a conversation that I think the American people across the political spectrum want to be having with the leaders of our nation's largest businesses, which is what is the responsibility of businesses to share with their employees the revenue that they make in good times. We know those businesses impose layoffs and stagnant wages in hard times. And what's the obligation to share with your employees when times are good, like they've been at J.P. Morgan Chase? Congresswoman
Porter, can you stay with us through a commercial break? I want to squeeze in one more commercial break because I'd love to ask you about something I saw in your hearing today that I have never seen before. Can you just hang with us over a minute
Absolutely.
here? Great. We're going to be right back. Here's something we've never seen a chairman of the Federal Reserve asked about in a congressional hearing.
If you got a call from the president today or tomorrow, and he said, I'm firing you, pack up, it's time to go, what would you do?
Well, of course, I would not do that.
I can't hear you.
My answer would be no.
And you would not pack up and you would not leave?
No, ma'am.
Because you think the president doesn't have the authority? Is that why you would not leave?
I have, I've kind of said what I've intended to say on the subject, and what I've said is that the law clearly gives me a 4-year term, and I fully intend to serve it.
Congresswoman Katie Porter was in that hearing. I've never seen a moment like that. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I was really encouraged to hear Chairman Powell stand up for the institution of the Federal Reserve. It's really important that it be independent from political pressure, whether it's from Congress or from the president. And so it was, frankly, since I've been in Washington for the first 6 months here, I haven't seen a lot of people with spines. So it was really nice to see somebody stand up to the president and make clear that they're committed to doing their job, not to just doing what the president orders them to do.
Well, he does have a law that allows him to stand up that way, which most other Trump appointees do not. I'd
agree, but a lot of those Trump appointees in cabinet secretaries, for example, have statutes that they're charged with enforcing. That's part of taking on the mantle of the agency. And yet we see many of them unwilling to take on those responsibilities. That's frankly how I feel about Secretary Carson and why I've called on him to resign. So I was heartened to hear Mr. Powell say that he intends to continue his work. I don't agree with him about everything, but I do admire the way he stood up for the fact that the Federal Reserve's independence is a really important component of our economy.
I wanted to quickly get your reaction as both a law professor and a member of Congress to the appeals court hearing yesterday on the Affordable Care Act, where the Trump administration is trying to destroy it completely and have it declared unconstitutional.
Yeah, this is a disaster for the American public. If the court rules the ACA unconstitutional, millions of Americans will lose their health care. In my own district, the most recent analyses show that about 6%, 44,000 people would lose health care almost immediately. The estimates could be higher than that. So I think this is a really unfortunate effort by the Trump administration to try to do through the courts what they weren't able to do legislatively, even with the Republicans in the majority. The reality is the vast majority of Americans want to improve the Affordable Care Act. They want to try to address prescription drug pricing. They don't want to see health care dismantled. They don't want to return to a time when people with pre-existing conditions, newborn babies coming into this world, couldn't even get health insurance.
Congresswoman Katie Porter gets tonight's last word. Thank you very much for joining us again, Congresswoman. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.